entering Victorian London, the year 1888.
Unemployment was really high. If you were a woman, generally you could have got work at a factory, but then jobs were difficult to come by. So for women of a particular class, prostitution was an option, as a profession. However, it was not a profession that women would have done lightly. It was a profession that would have brought great stigma with it. They probably would have been in some sort of, desperation, didn't have a partner, maybe had children, had to basically just fend for themselves. But it was big business. So it was a profession where you could earn more money being a prostitute than you could working for 12 hours at the mill. And that was because in these industrial towns, people were coming, they had money, they had wealth, especially if you look at London, which was, you had the Thames, so you had sailors in and people like that who had disposable income.
The infrastructure in Whitechapel wasn't there to support the hordes of people who came into London from Europe, escaping whatever persecution they were coming from. A lot of people coming from Ireland, escaping also the potato famines that was going through at the time. The infrastructure of Whitechapel didn't have the means to support them. There was documented that at any one time there was in the region of 15,000 people living on the streets of Whitechapel. We're talking men, women and child living on the streets. They were homeless. They had very, very poor lifestyles. They would, if they had money at the end of the day, they would be able to stay in what was called doss houses. Doss houses were basically a building which was divided into little sections, wooden sections akin to wooden coffins, and the women would pay 4 pence to sleep in these coffins overnight. In the morning they would be ejected from the building. It was not a bed and breakfast, it was where they would be able to just sleep, and they would be ejected come the morning to start the process all over again. These women drank a lot to help them, I would imagine, to get through the days.
That even before these women started selling sexual services, they were criminal, they were thieves, they were alcoholics. And this is the narrative that we get today. When we talk about sex workers, we don't just talk about them selling sexual services. We get, so what was in the 19th century was gin and syphilis is now crack and AIDS. So we get this kind of narrative that's not actually changed at all. And it kind of gives us an excuse to further depersonalise and create verminous communities. And sex workers are often perceived as verminous. And when a community is perceived as verminous, extermination of that vermin is never considered to be a bad thing. Street trash, it's visible. These are visible street problems. So if as soon as they're not there, that's a good thing. But that wasn't necessarily the case. People weren't necessarily immoral or not believers in God because they did this because this was acts of survival as well. There wasn't benefit systems, there wasn't any of that then, so it was to actually survive.
If they weren't married, then they would have to resort to prostitution. Women were the properties of their husbands, so if for any reason, as happened to some of them, if for any reasons their husband left them or died, they had to resort to whatever means they could to survive, and invariably that meant prostitution.
We've got this utter kind of stream of dehumanisation and denigration from loads of different avenues, but more importantly, we don't get the victims' perspectives themselves. The academy itself and a lot of feminism does not accept the right for sex workers or abolitionists. So sex workers are often very rarely represented and certainly even rarer allowed to represent themselves. And this is just an abhorrent state of affairs in the 21st century. When a sex worker is harmed, either in the past or now, there is automatically a kind of cultural projection of culpability. Mm-hmm. If she weren't on the streets at that time, if she weren't going away with strangers, she'd still be safe. Women provide sexual services, and that's a very different thing. Mm-hmm. It's a momentary thing that stops, it ends when the transaction stops. And I think that needs to be reframed. But these kind of things come into morality and very much into the religious practices of the time in the East End. And these things were very class-based too. Sex was something for the working class, as it speaks, and there's a vast array of sources that talk about the ungodliness of the East End and that it's a mire and that these women themselves weren't human at all, but rather the devil incarnate. Prostitution for survival still has its own agency and should be respected. I think in terms of representation, one of the things that kind of startles me a little bit is the fact that tourism actually started during the spate of the murders. Yes, we got the visiting to the sites themselves, and at the site of Annie Chapman's death, there was the neighbours around the houses charging people a penny a time to come and look at the site where the body was found, and they did actually run for quite a long time, but the police did have to close down operations. Likewise, there was in Mitre Square, it was a post-murder of Catherine Eddowes described as being something more than a circus, and people would come and actually stamp on the spot where the wretched woman was murdered. The victims have had all of their life removed and have just become corpses. There's a complete role reversal in the way that culture has dealt with both killer and victims in this instance. One that we don't usually see because often the killers are caught. So people don't have that ability to do this, yet when they do, look what they've done. And I think that's not just because Jack killed or Jack got away with it, but it's as equally as responsible for the fact that the people he did kill were sex workers. Violence against women is an integral social problem historically, and we're not getting any leeway with any of this. But I think if we start decoding moments in history that have become pivotal, then perhaps we can work from that and pull out from that and use the arguments, this is what, how can we have the same attitudes towards murdered women in 1888 as we can in 2017? Let's be in no doubt what this man did to these women, but I don't think we should use the kind of glorification and porny aspects of using their actual photographic images to tell this story. I just think that's truly wrong. These women deserve more respect than that. By all means, discuss what he did. The truth needs to be out about what Jack the Ripper is and, well, the Whitechapel murderer is and what the Whitechapel murderer did. But please don't do it by looking at the photographs of the women. This is the aspect of the ripperological industry that I want to challenge. That under no circumstance is it appropriate to speak about these women like that. They are not tools to facilitate your whodunit. Their lives have been ended. And I think that is so important.
We have no idea why these women were killed. We do not know who the killer was. He was never caught, nor was he identified.
To look at this kind of history needs to look at all angles of it. We can't just focus on Jack and we can't just focus on victims. I think each takes its value from the other. So to get a more kind of holistic approach to this history, we need to look at both things together. So where the victims by and large have been dehumanised, being brought down to be sort of representations of disease and immorality, we've got Jack that does the other thing. Jack transcends what's human. He can be anything at any given time. He's been written to be doctors. Often when he's been given that kind of elite identity, they will kind of argue that the crimes are crimes of the mind, a British man's crime. They're more clean, they're neat, they have a purpose. Whereas if he's, say, being suggested that he may be, say, Eastern European, they will talk about the savagery, they will talk about the sexual savagery involved. And we get these narratives that kind of follow different constructs of race and class. Many people have argued that the kind of Jack the Ripper kind of iconography of the cloak and the top hat and the case has kind of come from the fact that the East versus the West, the women versus something other, and we've got this really kind of polarised narrative there. I mean, there are a number of kind of thoughts of where this iconography come from, something to do with, say, the Gothic things and Dracula and the cloak, and then the spring-heeled Jack that was cloaked as well. So we get this build-up of stuff, but it pulls from sort of elite iconography at the time. This is nothing more than mythology, but the mythology does actually make Jack something other. His masculinity morphs from one thing to the other. At the time, we spoke very much of the monstrous. He was something akin to a Pawnee Indian, the Times called him. Other newspapers said that he was half man, half beast. We had the beast man of Whitechapel and all these kind of things. But as through the sort of 19th century, that evolved into all kinds of things. We should not be looking to sexual criminals to be our sexual icons, particularly ones that killed and got away with it. You know, this is the absolute worst case scenario, but here we have this glorification and glorification of Jack the Ripper, which just imbues all of society. time and time again, and I mean with an alarming regularity. Sex killers reference Jack the Ripper either in their own witness statements or during their crime. An escort was killed last year. On the day of her murder, her killer had googled the crimes of Jack the Ripper and kind of got his MO, and after her murder carved Jack into her stomach. So we've got this direct link with a repetition of murders. So we've got this celebration of this myth. It's not a man. Jack the Ripper's not a man. He's a social construct, and he's one that morphs to suit any arena that he's produced in. And then we get, when those representations are removed from safe spaces and interpreted by the wrong person, it contributes to the loss of life. So actually there's a real seriousness in deconstructing all of this. Yes, Jack the Ripper killed women and not just dirty, diseased whores. And Jack the Ripper wasn't real. He's nothing to be admired. He was nothing more than a sexual deviant and murderer. One of the things that kind of complicates analyses and refocusing on the victims of these crimes is that we don't know how many victims there were. They started in April 88 and they ran through until February 1891. Approximately 16 women were killed in similar circumstances. We know that the women had been married at most point. We know that they were family women. They'd had quite some hardships between them.
The women who were the victims of the person called Jack the Ripper, they were basically walking targets for him. They, for the most part, were all prostitutes. Most of them lived on the streets. They had very, very poor lifestyles.
It is believed that Jack, the Whitechapel murderer, when he killed the other women, he killed them out on the streets. He killed them where the police were walking the beats every 15 minutes, so his timing had to be meticulous not to get caught. He had gaslight at best, and his risk of being disturbed was phenomenally high.
He killed them by cutting their throats from ear to ear and then cutting them open, disemboweling them, removing organs and placing some around the body. Body parts were removed and taken away.
Melvin McNaughton, he didn't work on the crimes. He was the commissioner of the police that came along afterwards, revised the case after the killings had stopped, and from looking at sort of the MO and signature wounding, said that Jack the Ripper killed 5 women and 5 women only. I think it comes down to sexual attraction again. We have with the other victims, by and large, women of middle age, women beyond perhaps childbearing age, women who were deemed to be ugly, have not been beaten with the stick of Venus. Holly Nichols, Annie Chapman, there was Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, both killed on the 30th of September of the double event, and then there was Mary Jane Kelly. After the killing of Elizabeth Stride, which was just a slash to the throat and no abdominal or breast mutilation, it was seen that his thirst for that act had not been satisfied, so he then went to Mitre Square.
On one particular night, 2 women was killed. It's referred to as the double event. The second of the 2 murders was a woman called Catherine Eddowes.
She was the supermodel of the group. Look at her cheekbones. Just look at her cheekbones. All I could see was the picture of a dead woman. When he killed Catherine Eddowes, he really brutalised her. Again, there was facial mutilations there, and up till that point, it was something that's highly considered that she'd had kidneys removed, and body part removal was thorough through and through. I've heard every conceivable insult for these women. You wouldn't have believed it, and it's all about their physical appearance. However, Mary Jane Kelly is a delightful woman of Irish origin, bilingual, I believe had been a courtesan in Paris for a while too. Very, very savvy woman, clever, beautiful.
Mary was the only one of the 5 victims who was killed in her room. All the other women were killed on the streets, but perhaps because the killer had the time and the opportunity and also the privacy, he was able to kill her, and Mary turned out to be the most mutilated of all the victims.
We know that all of the women killed were homeless except Mary Jane Kelly. We know that they were in doss houses.
Mary was a young woman of 25 years of age. She was the youngest of all the victims. The other women were in their mid to late 40s. She was a very attractive young lady, and we do know that at some point she was She had a partner who she lived with in the room. They broke up and he moved out.
Mary Jane Kelly seems to have been elevated above all the victims in case of importance. And I think the second part of this is the fact that her injuries were so incredibly brutal. So incredibly brutal. Her partner, or ex-partner, Joseph Barton, had said he could only identify her by her ear and her eyes. Her face was mutilated, her thighs were stripped to the bone, her viscera was emptied, her breasts were removed. For example, on the day that Mary Jane Kelly's post-mortem report appeared in the Times, there was a letter from a local vicar, Canon Barnett, saying that actually what we shouldn't be concerning ourselves with is the acts of a madman and worry more about the morality of our neighbours. So even in death, and even though the injuries the women had endured were blatantly published in full glory, even men of the cloth still said that the killer was not as bad as the victims. We don't want to talk about the fact that the women's vaginas were removed. We don't want to even say the word vagina. In many of the ripological texts, they will refer to private parts. And I've publicly argued on a number of occasions that there was nothing about these women's parts that were private. They've been discussed for 130 odd years. They were left in public, they were removed, but yet we're still too scared to say this is about women's sexual reproductive organs, which was a key kind of facet to the whole murders. That's where he focused his injuries. Another thing that I find particularly challenging is the way in which the victims themselves have become the icons of horror. And what I mean by this are places particularly like, say, the London dungeons, whom, although they proclaim to represent something like 1,000 years of London's history, focus something like 8 of their 10 galleries on 10 weeks in Whitechapel. There goes kind of improving what an important sort of narrative this really, really is. The icons of horror are, say, there is a mock-up of Catherine Eddowes, laid splayed with her intestines everywhere. Something to be looked at, something to be frightened by, something to be made uncomfortable by. And I think that's kind of a standard practice for the people who go to see the London dungeons. However, those of us more informed will notice that through the windows in Mitre Square, the mock-up, are the actual post-mortem photographs of the women, the genuine victims, shone through the windows to kind of create this eerie feeling. Now, a lot of people wouldn't recognise what those images were, but I do. A number of the post-mortem photographs, they're all quite commonplace, and I have a real issue with this. I think we need to be discussing the horror of the injuries. Let's be in no doubt what this man did to these women, but I don't think we should use the kind of glorification and porny aspects of using their actual photographic images to tell this story. The London dungeon, again, seems to be a key centre of my irk in the representations of the women killed in Whitechapel. In 2008, following their huge refit, I think it cost something like £20 million, this was a phenomenal refit. They actually advertised for current and ex-sex workers to play the part of the live-action victims of Jack the Ripper, right? Which is appalling before we even start. You know, these women were in constant dangerous situations, so the fact now that they can go and do this for fun is just something that blows my mind. However, there was a huge outcry in the Daily Mail ran a story that mothers and people, you know, visitors in general were being interviewed. Do you know that the London dungeons are applying for sex workers to come and do the live action roles of the victims? And it was almost unanimous, the response was, well, if prostitutes worked here, I wouldn't bring my children. If prostitutes worked here, I wouldn't come myself. But they were there to pruriently explore and be horrified, wax effigies of women who had been killed. And I think that's another thing that really needs to be looked at further. This is a multi-million-pound industry. So what does that tell you? What questions can we ask about this? If literally ridiculing victims of fatal sex crime are then used to sell tickets, to be able to ogle the wax effigies, to be able to look at Whitechapel, to be able to go in the 10 Bells pub and be spooked by Jack. Something's gone terribly wrong here. And it's going to take a lot of historians and a lot of cultural kind of observers to try and challenge this. It's permeated too many spaces.
I think if we look at the present day and look at how we think about these sort of crimes, you know, there have been serial killers in the 20th century, 21st century all over the world that have murdered prostitutes. And it's still rather unfortunate that we don't know these girls' names, but we know them as prostitutes. So it's almost like because of their profession, they've lost their identity. We'll try not to glamorise these serial killers because they don't need glamorising, you know. But not to glamorise what they did, but to put it in reality that, you know, they murdered somebody's daughter, you know, they murdered somebody's sister, they murdered somebody's mum. And I think that's the important thing to remember in all of this, that these were somebody's loved ones. I feel that we're sending a message out there, especially, you know, to other women and to men out there and anybody who thinks that, you know, who can stick labels on people. I think that now is the time, if you look at society as a whole now, I think we see occupations and, you know, gender and feminism. I think we're kind of really taking sort of a shift in society about how we view individuals and how we view people. And I think now is a good time to talk openly about these women and about prostitution, and, you know, why women would choose that as a profession, or why some women didn't have a choice. For some women, prostitution wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, it was something that they had to do.
History has made these women victims as much as the killer has, and I think that's something that really needs to be redressed. Not just for the women who died in Whitechapel, but for sex workers who've died since, and for sex workers who are still working in dangerous conditions.